40 years, Dali has been one of the two most famous painters alive. His moustache was the only rival to Van Gogh's ear and Picasso's potency.
Do you have any trouble with it at night? I mean, do you have to peg it or anything like that, or does it stand up at night?
No, in the night, clean every night. They come in soft, sleep.
So at night it droops down while you're sleeping.
Completely.
And then in the morning, up she goes again.
3 minutes. Only in 3 minutes, fix my moustache.
And then you feel you can face the world with that wonderful moustache standing up.
Yes, because every day becoming much more practical for my inspiration.
Well, I'm fascinated to know that.
He has also been a great embarrassment with the political views of Torquemada, the greed of a barracuda, and the vanity of an old drag queen.
Everybody talk about eccentricity. It's a little true, but I'm total and absolutely paradoxical man. Yeah, it's true, I'm eccentric, but in the same time, I'm concentric. Eccentric and concentric.
He started tamely enough as an art student in Madrid in the early 20s. But around 1925, he discovered what realism could do. It could subvert one's sense of reality. Instead of a modernist surface, Dali went in for what he called all the most paralyzing tricks of eye-fooling: photographic accuracy, masses of detail, and smooth paint. To this he added what he called his paranoid critical method. Basically, this meant looking at one thing and seeing another, as these figures make up a face. Dali used this trick again and again in his paintings. This one is called The Metamorphosis of Narcissus. There he squats on the left, head on his knee, staring at his reflection in the pool. And the giant hand on the right, holding an egg from which a narcissus sprouts, exactly mimics his body. Dali's own considerable narcissism produced many self-portraits, some quite open, like this. Others were concealed, as in this painting called The Great Masturbator. A grasshopper clings to the soft yellow shape, which is Dali's profile, boned, as it were, and laid nose down on its side. And that same profile, by now as runny as wax, turns up on the beach in his most famous image, The Persistence of Memory. Dali had a brilliant sense of provocation. He even managed to alarm Breton with this one and provoke a solemn argument among his fellow surrealists upon whether a pair of pants spattered with feces was an acceptable dream image or not. Like a gland irritated by constant scratching, his mind threw off many such images before the end of the 30s, when they began to get rather tedious and predictable. And most of them had to do with sex, blood, dung, and putrefaction mixed with declarations of impotence and guilt. For Dali loved anything that spoke of flaccidity: runny cheese, flesh held up by crutches, soft watches. Dali inherited a lot from Spanish religious art, an almost paralyzing morbidity about flesh. It is phosphorescent, always on the point of dissolution and rot. In Dali, there is no such thing as the confident body of classicism, but there is no spiritual transcendence either. He locked himself up in the prison of the narcissistic self and then threw away the key. Eventually, the dreams weren't real at all. Just Dali being Dali, the Nickelodeon of the id. He had not reached his 40th birthday when Sigmund Freud had the last word on him. "It is not the unconscious that I seek in your pictures," he wrote, "but the conscious. Your mystery is manifested outright. The picture is only a mechanism to reveal it." So there he is, not great enough for marble, but just right for wax. It's proper that Dali should have found his place here in the Paris Wax Museum, the Musée Grévin, representing culture along with the novelist François Sagan and the clothes designer Pierre Cardin. For the Wax Museum was one of the favourite spots of Surrealism. It was a house of bizarre but second-hand illusion. Waxworks are neither art nor life. They're failures, they're sinister hybrids, and from that point of view, the cruder they are, the more potent they get. They mock the powers of art and offer none of the consolations of nature. No wonder the Surrealists liked them. Except as a backdrop, landscape was of no interest to Surrealism. They probably found it disagreeably bucolic. It was a city movement made by pale, aggressive young eggheads whose natural lair was the cafe and whose essential city was Paris. In fact, it's impossible to imagine Surrealism without Paris. And their equivalent to the endless variety of nature was the endless profusion of baffling objects which washed up here in the flea market. Of course, that was in the good old days before they started calling junk antiques, but even so, you never knew what you might find here. The flea market was like the unconscious mind of capitalism. It contained the repressed surplus. This is where the sewing machine met the umbrella on the operating table and in due course gave birth to a whole flock of progeny, a new art form, the surrealist object. The object was collage in 3 dimensions. The Surrealists thought that it made secret affinities visible. It was a way of declassifying the world and rendering it permeable to imagination. A head with the eyes closed with zippers became Marcel Jean's quietly sadistic image, the spirit of the gardenia. Victor Brauner made a wolf table. Dali made a whole compendium of his fetishes. Wolfgang Paulin called this articulated cloud, the source of rain and the protection against it fused into one image. And Mary Oppenheim produced the most famous and contradictory surrealist object of all, her fur cup and spoon, the very essence of uselessness. One particularly good object maker was the American photographer Man Ray, a veteran of Dadaism.
An object is a result of looking at something which in itself has no quality or charm. I pick something which in itself has no meaning at all. I disregard completely the aesthetic quality of the object. I'm against craftsmanship. I say the world is full of wonderful craftsmen, but there are very few practical dreamers. In the early days in Paris, when I first came over, and I passed by a hardware shop and I saw a flat iron in the window, I said, there's an object which is almost invisible. Maybe I could do something with that. What could I do is to add something in it that was provocative. So I got a box of tacks. I glued on a row of tacks to it to make it useless, as I thought. But nothing is really useless. You can always find a useless, even for the most extravagant object.
The iron, entitled Gift, was pure malice. This one he called Object to be Destroyed. The cult of objects underlined another aspect of the surrealist imagination, the belief that the marvellous, that state of almost sexual excitement that Breton called convulsive beauty, was always available, hidden just below the skin of reality. The artist who produced the best evidence for this idea lived in a modest house in a Belgian suburb, and his name was René Magritte. Magritte was Monsieur Bourgeois to the letter, stocky, taciturn, suburban. He died in 1968, but his work continues to serve its audience rather as Victorian story painters served theirs. People like stories, but modern art doesn't tell many, and Magritte did. However, his stories weren't narratives. They were snapshots of the impossible. In 1923, the architect Le Corbusier put this photo in his tract on the new machine architecture as an example of plain, rational design, a pipe. 5 years later, Magritte contradicted him with this painting. This is not a pipe. It became one of the most famous phrases in modern art, a manifesto about language, the way meaning is conveyed or frustrated by symbols. Because this indeed is not a pipe. It is a painting, a work of art, a sign that denotes an object and triggers memory. No painter had ever isolated that basic fact about art so clearly before. Denying the names of things took you through the mirror of illusion into a quite different world, where things change their names and lose their meanings. A candle equals a ceiling, and the moon, a shoe. The first characteristic of this world is dread, sometimes at the crude dramatic level of the silent movies that Magritte used to watch, which is echoed here in his painting, The Menaced Assassin. Magritte has given us some of the most vivid images of alienation in the whole lexicon of art. This one is entitled The Lovers. This, a painting of the most piercing sadness and sexual pungency, is called The Rape. The usual tone of Magritte's work was of a world both matter-of-fact and slightly out of control. Magritte painted things so ordinary that they might have come from a phrase book, an apple, a glass, a stolid Belgian nude, or a human eye. There wasn't much on that list that an average Belgian clerk circa 1935 might not have seen in the course of an average Belgian day. But then that clerk was one of Magritte's favourite images too. Here the clerks descend like rain on the roofs of Belgium as though they were commuting from heaven. In a painting, you have a canvas on an easel in front of a view. The canvas bears a picture of the view. This picture exactly overlaps the real view. And so the play between image and reality suggests that the real world is only a construction of mind, and that somewhere among the infinite number of ways of experiencing that world, there is one ideal angle from which art and reality overlap, match, and fuse. That is the moment of surrealist vision. Magritte's best images don't look like fantasy. They're dry, tightly painted, matter-of-fact, and even pedestrian. They seem to have more in common with reporting than with imagination. And so the proper response to them is the double take. Magritte loved paradox, and he was its absolute master. And his paradoxes needed the context of real life. His paintings are not so much about the world as about the ways we find to describe it. Magritte was obsessed by the weak hold that language has on what it describes. That sense of slippage between word and thing, image and object, is one of the sources of modernist disquiet, and in making it his subject, Magritte became one of the artists without whom modernist culture can't be understood. His visual booby traps go off again and again because their trigger is thought itself. When the cannon fires, the walls of familiar images go down and we stand, as the title of this painting tells us, on the threshold of liberty. The Surrealists had no heroes among politicians, dead or alive. But they did have a gallery of saints, of men and women who were considered to have lived out the ideals of the movement before its time. And of these, the greatest was the Marquis de Sade, whose castle here at La Coste in Provence was considered one of the sacred sites of the Surrealist movements. The Divine Marquis was the one 18th century man whom the Surrealists respected, because it was he who had preached the supremacy of desire, and it was he who had shown, what has become a commonplace in our century, that in order to establish the rule of reason, the imagination must be censored and repressed. Sade was the first writer to understand the relationship between sex and politics. He did most of his writing in prison, which is a good place for thinking about the unthinkable. He became the unspeakable answer to Rousseau and his milky doctrine of the natural goodness of man when left in a state of nature. Not so, said Sard. We don't know what our natures are, and moreover we can't find out what they are unless we follow our desires to the absolute limit, no matter how appalling the disclosures may be. Sard was a blasphemer, an atheist, and a traitor to his class, the aristocracy. No wonder then that he had such an appeal to the Surrealists, who were also atheists, blasphemers, and traitors to their class, the bourgeoisie. The Surrealists' tributes to Sard, like this proposed monument to him by Man Ray, often had a blasphemous tone, which may seem a little dated today. But the Surrealists were almost all baptized Catholics, living in France when the church still had a great deal of power. The best crack was by Max Ernst, the Virgin Mary spanking the infant Jesus, watched by the three wise men, Éluard, Breton, and Ernst himself. Sex, being loaded with taboo, was one of the great Surrealist themes. But the Surrealists only stood for one kind of sexual freedom, which insisted that imagination could only be set free by single-minded devotion to one woman. Yet this romantic spirit did not translate into their art. There, the idea of woman was a thing, a mannequin, or a piece of furniture. In Hans Bellemayre's sculpture, the woman is no more than a sexual doll, abused, manipulated, intensely pornographic. As the 30s wore on through the Spanish Civil War towards 1939, their tone was less frustration than apocalypse. Max Ernst summed up the sense of foreboding in one prophetic painting called Europe After the Rain, a place reduced to creepy namelessness, a vacated planet, all ruins and jungle and decay. And when the rain in fact did come and the German army rolled into France, the Surrealists prudently ran. Many of them went to America, and so it was in New York that the remains of Surrealism took root and mutated. But the greatest American artist of the irrational was already living there in a frame house on Utopia Parkway in Queens, outside Manhattan. His name was Joseph Cornell, and he made boxes. In one sense, the box was a metaphor of Cornell's own shyness. Very few American artists have ever so banished their outward lives to preserve their inward one. And there were its emblems, preserved under glass, filed away inside the wooden walls. They represent a distant reality, not a historical reality exactly, more like a theatre of memory whose images keep crossing and recombining. The birds, the planets, the charms, the provincial hotels and ballerinas and foreign postage stamps. It could have looked precious like Victoriana, but it didn't because Cornell had such a rigorous sense of form, strict and spare like good New England carpentry. De Chirico's paintings were full of nostalgia for lost experience, but in Cornell there is much less sense of loss. Everything is there and possessed, as memories are in the mind. Some of the boxes were very elaborate. This one he called the Egypt of Mademoiselle Cléo de Mérode. She was a famous French courtesan of the 1890s, renowned equally for her greed and her beauty. In effect, Cornell compares her to Cleopatra and makes a casket for her with the emblems of Egypt in it. A sphinx, sand, pearls, serpents of the Nile, and so on. Cornell was already a developed artist, though unknown, before the Surrealists came to America. The side of the American irrational that got most from Surrealism in the 40s was the work of painters like Jackson Pollock, Mark Rothko, and Achille Gorky, later to be numbered among the abstract expressionists. And among them, the main bridge was Gorky. He had a peculiar career, this Armenian refugee, with his florid imagination, deep insecurities, and eventual suicide at 44. For the best part of 20 years, he turned out pastiches of the artists that he wanted to become, of Picasso and then of Miro, imitating him in paintings like this. And then, quite suddenly, Gorky found himself. The spidery, fluent line that he had got from Miro began to describe landscapes of not quite abstract form, shapes like flower stems, tendons, sexual organs, livers and feathers. The canvas pulsates. It's filled with a kind of glowing, sweaty, pre-conscious life. It looks into the body and not out from it. A great issue among the New York painters was myth. Like the Surrealists, they felt rational civilization had let them down. They wanted painting to return its audience to what they imagined was primitive reality, to art as a magical sign. And so Jackson Pollock, in the years before he began to drip paint directly on the canvas, used these charged, meaty squiggles of paint to translate the shapes of Southwest Indian art, of rock pictographs and sand paintings, into images like this one, The Key, done in 1946. Or Male and Female, painted 4 years before. Painting accumulated resonance by appealing to myth. But the myths were in decline, and the painters were not Indians or cavemen, but New Yorkers living in the age of psychoanalysis. They were like religious artists without a context, and like the Surrealists, they concluded that the only unpolluted areas left to the modern imagination were the unconscious and the distant past. With their tiny audience and their exalted sense of the artist's role, American painters like Mark Rothko, or here Hans Hofmann in the 1940s, were the last romantics, the last artists to paint as though art had the power to change the objective conditions of life. For them, the Surrealist ideal still held true, although there was no chance that it would come true. And no promised liberation of the mind could compare to the real liberation of Europe in 1945. The fact that so many of the Surrealists had gone to America guaranteed that Surrealism would be a dead issue in France after the war was won. After all, they had run away, and they could no longer command the respect earned by writers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus, who had stayed and resisted. So as a movement, Surrealism faded, and its absorption into chic, which had begun in the late 30s, became almost complete. The movement that had hoped to reshape the mind of Western man ended by advertising booze and cigarettes. But was that all? Not quite. For the memory of Surrealism, its deposit of ideas, was strip-mined by artist after artist in the 60s and 70s. As a proposition about freedom, it still remained infinitely intriguing. In 1969, the Romanian artist Christo wrapped a whole section of Australian coastline in plastic and rope. This harked back to 1920, when Man Ray wrapped a sewing machine in a blanket and called it the Enigma of Isidore Ducasse. By the same token, Breton wrote that the simplest surrealist act, the most gratuitous one, would be to walk into the street shooting a revolver at random into the crowd. Again, almost 50 years later, a Californian named Chris Burden fired a revolver at an airliner taking off over Los Angeles. He missed, and this action he called art. It is surprising when you look back on the 60s to see how much of their cultural surface was affected by Surrealism. A lot of the time, the kids who were enacting their pantomimes of desire and revolt didn't know this. There was the illusion that the world was being born again, the innocence renewed, the old contracts torn up in a new way. And the key to this was simply being yourself, whatever that self might be. From love-ins to the living theatre to the caterwaulings of stone poets, the word went out that art is me, me, me. Art is anything made by anyone called an artist. Quite so, but the question that such art begs is the same question that a lot of surrealist activity also skimped. Is the self, that great sacred cow of our culture, automatically interesting? Or Can it only hold our interest as art to the extent that it produces ordered structures? Looking back, I don't think there's much choice. But in the 60s there was, because then, diffused through the West, as in the 20s, you had a dandyistic theatrical revolt based upon a cult of youth, which, like Surrealism, was a romantic revival. Ecstasy, irrationality, old Dionysius trying to assert himself again, dressed like a pantomime wizard and nattering about hobbits and cosmic consciousness. If there was one link between Surrealism and the 60s, it was the illusion that youth was truth. By being born, one had surpassed history. By finding reality intolerable, one became a prophet. There was another war in Vietnam this time to help create an idea of class based on age. So it was thought, or rather felt. But all this fabric of illusion came apart in the 70s. So what remains of Surrealism? Not much. It became exactly what it set out not to be, a style, and not a very durable style at that. It took European artists the best part of 200 years to digest the implications of Michelangelo's nudes, but Surrealism was completely digested within a matter of 50 years, a quarter of the time. And in the meantime, its devices have come to look more nostalgic than revolutionary. The Magrittes and Ernsts that were once hard nuggets of contradiction now end up in the sale rooms fetching enormous prices, just more units in the smooth flow of exchange that blurs the meanings of all art. But there is another side to it, because Surrealism was less an art movement than a rebellion of the mind that chose painting as its vehicle. It may not choose to inhabit painting again. Yesterday, the poltergeist was throwing plates in the kitchen. Tomorrow, it may turn up in the hall. You don't know. It's a very durable spirit, and it's hard to exorcise. But it loves everything that is contrary, extravagant, and free. And its very cussedness, its perversity, is a form of innocence, a declaration of hope.